considered myself a Holocaust survivor. When you think in terms of Holocaust survivors, you think somebody who was in a concentration camp maybe has a number on their arm, or like Anne Frank was a hidden child. There are many, many stories that Holocaust survivors have. And I didn't fit any of those profiles. So for most of my life, I never considered myself a survivor. But when I'm finished with my story, I hope you will agree that I can reclassify myself. Both my parents were born in Poland. And in the early 1900s, when they were children, there was something called pogroms, uprisings in Poland against the Jewish population. A pogrom is when a certain group of people are picked on by the government or their agents to be selected as targets. So both my mother and my father's families left Poland and traveled through Europe looking for safe haven. Both families ended up settling in Berlin, Germany. Now Berlin was a very, very modern city. Had lots of theaters and lots of museums and was very welcoming. And they were able to go to public school. My father's family, he was one of 8 children. They established a bakery. And it was a very profitable bakery. Of course, at that time, all the kids worked in the bakery. So all of the 8 kids helped run the bakery. My mother was one of 4, and she was trained after high school as a dressmaker. Not just a run-of-the-mill, but she worked in a very high-end dress shop. You didn't buy clothes off the rack at the time, like Borden or whatever. You either made your own clothes or somebody made them for you. And my mother made beautiful clothing for the very wealthy women in the neighborhood. But by the time my parents met, something known as the Nuremberg laws were enacted. These were some 400 laws against the Jewish population. A man by the name of Adolf Hitler had been elected, so-called, or appointed as Chancellor of Germany. And he was determined that he was going to get rid of the entire Jewish population. He felt that the Jewish population was what they called Untermenschen, subhuman, in contrast to Übermenschen, or superior people of the German groups of Aryans, they called them. So life in Germany, by the time my parents met, for the Jewish people, was very difficult. My father's brother, 3 sisters, and his parents found Germany to be very unwelcoming, and they left and settled in a place called Palestine, which is now the state of Israel. My mother's brother wasn't happy in Germany either. So he left and he went to Havana, Cuba. Then something happened on November 9th and 10th of 1938, known as Kristallnacht. Marched through the streets, smashing the windows of every business that was owned by Jews. They smashed the windows of the synagogues, the Jewish house of worship, took the holy books onto the street and burned them. That was basically the day that World War II began. It was no longer safe for Jews to be in Germany. Chancellor Hitler swore to take all the Jews and throw them out and get rid of them. The day after Kristallnacht, my father was put on a train with hundreds of other men and sent back to Poland, his country of origin, they called it. He was sent to Warsaw, the capital of Poland, where he found himself sharing a 1-bedroom apartment with 12 other men. But that wasn't the biggest problem.
he left his wife, my mother, and me, his baby, back in Berlin and didn't know what our fate was going to be. He had absolutely no idea of what was going to happen to him. My mother found out that if she could get a visa, now a visa is not like MasterCard Visa. This visa is a piece of paper issued by a country that permits you to enter their country. She found out if she could get a visa to a country, my father could come back to join us on the condition that we leave Germany. So she and her two sisters started standing on lines of every embassy, every consulate that was in Berlin, sometimes days on end, begging and pleading with any country that would issue them a visa. My mother was thrilled. She got a visa to a place called Siam. That's now the country of Thailand. Third world country, not very sophisticated, not very modern, but that didn't matter. Now she had a piece of paper that said another country would accept us. So she registered it, and my father was able then to make his way back from Warsaw to Berlin on the condition that we leave Germany immediately. It doesn't take overnight to get from Warsaw to Berlin. It took a couple of weeks. In the meantime, my mother also had sent money to her brother in Cuba, asking him to see if he could buy a visa to Cuba. After all, Cuba was much closer to the United States, and that really was the ultimate goal. While my father was traveling back from Poland to Germany, the visa for Cuba came. They called it a landing permit instead of a visa, but it basically was the same kind of a piece of paper. My mother had a decision to make. Should she go to Siam or should she go to Cuba? Well, we didn't know anybody in Siam, and it was a backworld country. Or go to Cuba, where my uncle was living, and that would be much closer to the United States as well. So she was able to book passage on a ship called the MS St. Louis. It was a Hamburg America line, and they were taking reservations for Havana, Cuba. My father came back to Berlin. They packed what little they were allowed to take, only one suitcase per person. Got on a train and headed to Hamburg, Germany, where the dock was for this ship. So we got on the train and we got to the dock, and lo and behold, this gorgeous cruise ship is there. And there were bands playing, and there was a flags flying all over the place, and there was a photographer running around taking pictures of everybody, and it was very festive. And if any of you have ever been on a cruise to the Bahamas or to the Caribbean, you're treated like royalty. It's beautiful. And getting on this ship were not over 900 Jews escaping Germany, escaping the terrible traumas that they were experiencing, and headed across the ocean to Havana, Cuba, which was a paradise destination island. All the cruises went to Cuba. It was a beautiful, beautiful voyage. And the trip over was wonderful. There was dances and parties and movies, and there was even a swimming pool on deck. And it was a lovely voyage. But the minute we got to Havana Harbor, the ship wasn't allowed to dock. They kept us at anchor in the waters outside of Havana Harbor. Nobody knew what was going on. Captain gets all dressed up and gets on this little boat and he goes to the dock. Lots of whispering going on. And then the captain comes back. And the passengers are very much afraid of what was going on because the ship was not allowed to dock. Finally, the captain came on the PA system and promised the passengers that under no circumstances would he take them back to Germany. He wasn't a member of the Nazi Party, and he didn't agree with their philosophy. And he was going to protect his passengers because he knew that if he took the passengers back to Germany, they would not survive. Some of the passengers had already been interned in concentration camps. And they knew that if they went back to Germany, they would not survive. And there's all this negotiation going on. You know, little boats coming to the ship, having conferences with the captain. The captain gets all dressed and he goes back to the port. But nobody knows what's exactly happening. Nobody knew what was going on behind the scenes at President Brew of Cuba's inner circle. The Nazi Party had placed their agents into Havana's government to advise President Brew not to accept the passengers. The papers that we carried were issued by a man who was the enemy, so to speak, of President Brew. He had issued these papers, and whatever money we paid for them, and they were very expensive, all the money was pocketed by this man who issued the papers. And President Brew of Cuba was not a very nice guy anyway, very corrupt. And he found out that he didn't get any of that money. He had no problem in accepting the advice of these Nazi propaganda people. So he declared our papers to be worthless and would not recognize them. And anyone that held those papers could not come ashore. 22 people had papers issued by a different person. They were the only ones allowed to leave the ship. The captain was very upset. He said, you know, we're only 90 miles away from America. Surely the United States would allow us to dock. So we turned the ship around and came to the shores of Miami. My father used to say, we got so close to Miami that you can almost read the license plates on the taxis on Ocean Avenue. That's how close we were to America, with the beautiful palm trees and the gorgeous hotels. And the minute we got that close, the United States Coast Guard came out and threw us out of American waters. They were afraid that the captain would try to dock the ship, or that maybe somebody would try to jump overboard to swim ashore. So now we are again rejected by America. Telegrams had been sent to the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. He didn't even answer the telegrams. The idea that the Nazi Party had by letting us go on this ship was very, very carefully planned. They wanted to show the world that they were letting us go and nobody wanted us. They were going to take care of this unwanted cargo. And that was their pledge. And that became a significant idea of the Nazi Party in eliminating the Jewish population. Now the captain had no choice. He had to turn the ship back towards Europe. But he promised the passengers he would not go back to Germany with them because he knew what their fate was going to be. He even said that he would beach the ship and set it ablaze if necessary, rather than bring the passengers back to Germany. But many, many organizations were contacting every country in the world, looking for a place for us to dock. On our way back to Europe, 4 countries agreed to take some passengers. We were only 900 people. But no one country agreed to take 900 people. Belgium, Holland, France, and England each agreed to take some passengers. My father was an extremely wise man. He asked to be put on the list for England. Now, many years later, I asked him, why did you choose England? I mean, after all, when the ship docked in Antwerp, Belgium, his sister, her husband, and their baby was standing there to greet us. And you'd think he would go to a country where he had family. But he said that he did not want to be that close to Germany. He chose England because, number one, it was the furthest away from Germany, and he thought maybe the English Channel would be a buffer. Little did he know that of the 4 countries, would be the only country that was not invaded by Nazi troops within weeks. England of the 4 was the only country that fought on the side of the Allies against Germany. Living in London for the entire war was not a piece of cake either. Germany and the Nazi troops started bombing London, where we lived, almost nightly. They did most of the bombing during the night. My father, because he was a baker, would work at night. My mother and I were left alone, and we spent many, many, many nights in bomb shelters. Now let me describe a bomb shelter to you. About half the size of this room, and a long table down the middle, and benches around the outside, and was supposed to house about 50 people. But you would squeeze in maybe 150. You could spend an hour or 8 hours, depending on how long the air raid lasted, squeezed into this little shelter that was 6 feet underground and 6 feet above ground, made of brick. Really didn't protect you from a direct hit of a bomb. The only real thing it protected you from was debris from the buildings around you that were being destroyed. Many mornings, my father would come home from work and not find us in the shelter because it had been evacuated, and spend the whole day looking for us to where we had been evacuated to. No cell phones then. But life in London was a piece of cake compared to what it might have been had we gone to Belgium, Holland, or France. Because those countries were overrun by Nazi troops within weeks and months. And many of those St. Louis passengers that went to those countries did not survive. And we in England had the best chance of survival. We spent the entire war in England, and a year after the war, my parents and I came to America, which of course had always been our aim. My mother's two sisters had been able to come to America because they had in-laws who lived in America who supplied support for them. When we came to America, we docked in New York, again on a ship, but we came in on Memorial Day weekend and there was a dock strike. We weren't able to get off the ship. It was very frightening because we remembered what happened in Havana. But fortunately, the strike was over after the weekend and we were able to get off the ship. And I spent that first summer in Belmont, New Jersey. My mother's sister had settled there. Spent my first summer in the Atlantic Ocean learning how to swim, loved it. Ended up marrying somebody from Belmont, New Jersey, and after being raised in Astoria, Queens, I moved to Long Branch, and now Neptune, and Ocean Township in between. That's basically my story. I've left a lot of holes in the story, and I hope that you will be able to ask questions to fill those little holes in my story. But I now live in Neptune. I spent many years working for Fort Monmouth in the Department of Defense as a way of paying back for my being grateful for having finally been allowed to come to America. Been able to practice my religion, be educated, and now, of course, speak to students and adults as well. And the reason I changed my mind about my status as a survivor of the Holocaust is because my parents and I were part of a ship that was predetermined by the Nazi Party to show the world what they planned to do. And they did. 17 million people. Not army, not military, nobody with uniforms. 17 million civilians were murdered because they were different. That if hate and bigotry, prejudice and anti-Semitism are allowed to fester and grow, this is what happened during World War II. 6 million Jews were killed. The others were not Jews, but just different. Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, disabled. Anyone who looked or acted different was a target by Nazi troops. We were known as what's called Untermenschen, subhuman, to their Übermenschen, superior people. And they were going to eliminate anyone that didn't fit the profile. And I feel that because I was one of those people on that ship, even though I don't have conscious memory, my parents shared the story with me. That now I had a message. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I know nobody likes homework. But this homework doesn't have to be finished for 20 years or so. But I want to promise that it is done. Because we survivors are not going to be here much longer, just by virtue of our age. It is your responsibility and your assignment is to pass on the message of the Holocaust to your family, your children, and your grandchildren, and every generation. that if hate and bigotry and prejudice are allowed to grow and fester, we, God forbid, might live it again. And we're seeing it as we sit here, happening in other areas and even in America. Genocides, killings of innocents are still happening. And each one of you has not the right, but the responsibility to stand up against bullying, against hate. America allows you and enforces you to do so. Each individual has a responsibility to be an upstander, not a bystander. Eddie Wiesel said, being a bystander is like being the perpetrator. So your homework assignment is to pass on the message of the Holocaust to the next generation so that it doesn't happen again. And we, God forbid, do not have to live through that trauma. I hope you have a lot of questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored, honestly, to be standing here before you all today. Without my grandfather, who you'll get to know a lot of his quotes. They're peppered through the presentation, but one of his favorite quotes was, "To know where you're going, you must know where you're coming from." Although he used to say it with a pretty thick accent, so it was more like, "To know where you are going, you must know where you are coming from." But I don't do him so well. You're going to hear from him in just a moment. But this is the first page of the placard that they held up for his Shoah Foundation testimony. So that is an organization that was born out of the project of Schindler's List, which you might have heard of as a movie Steven Spielberg directed, and probably heard of Steven Spielberg. If you haven't heard of Schindler's List, you might have heard of Jurassic Park or some other big movies that he has been a part of. But my grandfather was interviewed along with my uncle and my cousin and possibly some other family members that I don't know yet. But we'll hear a little bit more from him. And then if you want to. So, it's really hard to see, but that is a picture of me as a baby. And of course, the best thing to do when you get in front of a group of strangers is to just embarrass yourself right away and show you a picture of myself as a baby, but you can't really see it. But that's me at about 1 year old. And my grandfather was, as he still is to this day, one of my most favorite people ever. So I just like to show the closeness that we shared. That picture kind of lets you know a little bit about our relationship. You could see, oh, there you go. Yeah, now you really see little baby picture, and my papa. So I called him Kwa, which is going to sound funny, but he used to take us and like hold us up to his neck and go kwa, 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 like that. And so I actually thought that was his name until I was like maybe a little bit younger than you guys, and I said, "I'm going to go see my Kwa," and all my friends like busted out laughing at me and said, "You cannot call him that." So now he's Papa. So this is Papa's story, and I'm here thanks to an organization called 3G. 3GNY or 3GNJ or 3G Philadelphia, wherever they send me, I will go. We have about 12 chapters nationwide, and we're even beyond just the United States, so we do have members that are even in other parts of the world, South Africa, Australia, all different kinds of places, and the 3G stands for third generation descendant of Holocaust survivors. So of course I did not survive the Holocaust, but my grandparents did. And their story is a little bit different than some that you might have heard and some that you may hear. So we can move on. I like to start at the beginning. My grandfather was born in Poland in a place called Lodz. people who study the Holocaust sometimes have heard of the Lodz ghetto. It was one of the big ones, but he was born there before it was a ghetto. He was born in September of 1922, September 8th, as a matter of fact. And he had a dad named Fischel. He had a mom named Bluma. My mom's actually named after my great-grandmother, Bluma. And his little brother, Max, who you'll meet, and also his little sister, who was named Hannah Pai. And he had a ton of cousins. Like he said, he was one of at least 100 relatives in the area, so he remembered having like a pretty much a normal upbringing. They weren't rich, they kind of struggled a lot, but they had a lot of love. The family loved music, loved singing, and he had a little song that he liked to sing about his mom and their relationship. So we'll hear it straight from him. If you can get that little video to play. I don't know. That part I don't know how to do. Maybe if you just hit like enter, it might work. I don't know. Sometimes.
Maybe like you have to get out of like the slideshow. Or maybe like
I definitely can't sing the song, but oh, there we go. All right. Oh, can't hear him. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Tired of again, my mama was up, die Welt ist schon gut, weil jüdische Mama, wer kann gleichen zu dir? Mein Mama nu, das ganze Leben, was ich habe weggegeben, um mit dir noch einmal zu sein.
So that's just a little taste of my grandfather. He loved to make up little songs, and he loved to sing songs of his childhood. That's a song called Yiddische Mama. It's actually a kind of a famous song. I have a cousin who's a musician, and she does like a beautiful rendition of that song, so it's pretty famous. And the line is that this mother is like the rarest thing, more special than gold, more special than any treasures, and you know, it's such a rare mother to have. So that's the way he felt about his mom. Hopefully you all feel that way about your moms and your dads and your grandparents, and we can move on to the next slide. And so, as I mentioned, they were not well-to-do. They lived in a part of Lodz that would later actually, they wouldn't have to move because it would become the ghetto. But before that, my great-grandfather had a milk delivery route. He had worked in textiles, which was a really big industry in Lodz, but he said that they were always striking and never working, and so he decided to go into business for himself because he couldn't make any money on strike, and so he worked 7 days a week delivering milk. And it wasn't even like bottles of milk that, you know, maybe your mother and father might remember. It was literally like bringing cans of milk to people's houses and filling up their containers, their little crocks or whatever they had for milk out of like a ladle. And so they had to walk, I always forget to translate this into miles. We're here, but he told me it was like 17 kilometers, whatever that would be in miles, probably a little bit less, but it was a very long walk. And so they bought their milk actually from German farmers. So, you know, by all intents and purposes, these people were, as my grandfather said, card-carrying Nazis in a sense, but they liked them. They had a relationship with them, and so they helped them even after what we'll come to know as the occupation, the invasion of Poland by both Germany and Russia. So we can go to the next slide. This is the map of Poland. I like to show this just because that's Lodz, where my grandfather was. And then this is Warsaw, this is Białystok, and then this is the Soviet Union area, okay? And then we've got the East, Germany, and then the Soviet Union. So we're really thinking of, you know, in terms of where things are. He was not quite in the middle, but pretty close. And we can go to the next slide. I just like to kind of put it on the map. Now, my grandfather, it was really cute. When he was interviewed in the Shoah Foundation, you have to think, he was about 17 years old. He turned 17. You'll hear a little bit more about that. But so he was around 16, 17 years old. And he didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life yet. So when she asked him what his plans were, he said, well, he just wanted to be a big shot because he was a soccer star. Anybody here play soccer? Any soccer players? No? Oh, a couple. So, you know, that was his life. He played soccer. He said he used to, you know, play soccer more than go to school. So take that as you will. And he said that even though there was a lot of anti-Semitism that was common in Poland and Łódź, even prior to the war, that he, as a soccer star, could kind of go anywhere he wanted in Łódź. So he knew that his little brother couldn't go to certain neighborhoods, or his little sister, but he could go because he said his friends would like take care of it for him. He was kind of a tough guy, which you can kind of imagine would help him in the future, that he kind of had that attitude. And we can move on to the next slide. I'd just like to mention that in the backdrop of all of this, kind of in the years leading up in Germany and around the kind of European areas, there was an event which we now know as either Kristallnacht, or sometimes now historians like to refer to it as the November pogroms, because pogroms are a kind of attack that have happened historically to Jewish people through many hundreds and thousands of years. So it kind of fits into a lineup of a certain way of being treated. This was an attack on Jewish-owned businesses. They were vandalized. This was an attack on Jewish homes. As you can imagine, this was a really scary thing, even if you weren't a Jewish German resident. If you were in Poland, which isn't that far away, as you could see from the map, looking at this, you're sort of thinking, well, what's going to happen? This coming down the pike is not looking good. And I don't want to get too much into the history because that's really not my job here, but that's just a very noteworthy event that my grandfather kind of saw, and with other things sort of started to give him some ideas that maybe he wasn't very safe. We can move on. And so another thing that my grandfather did, he was like a kind of a always forward-thinking guy. He was really, even though he wasn't necessarily like an academic scholar, like he said, you know, he liked to go play soccer, but he always had a book. Even as a kid, he literally read the Encyclopedia. I don't know if you guys have those anymore, but Encyclopedia Britannica from cover to cover at my house. Like, he knew everything about anything. You could ask him any question. He was like that even as a kid, and he and my Uncle Max, his little brother, had a little kind of a side business. They had a library, and they had rare books in it, books that were harder to get, and they would charge people money to lend the books. And then, of course, if they were late bringing them back, they had to get charged a little fee. And so you might know, if you've done any research into the Holocaust, that one of the things that happened during Kristallnacht and during some other times of these kind of pogroms and attacks on the Jewish community was a lot of big book burnings. They were actually bringing books from all different places and then rounding them up into a public area, and they would burn them. Well, my grandparents and my great-grandparents, my grandfather rather, and my uncle and my great-grandparents realized some of the books in this collection could get them in trouble, maybe even killed. So you can kind of listen to my uncle here. This is my Uncle Max, so also interviewed for the Shoah.
It's worth for me to point out, as a child, and I think I was not an ignorant child, I read a lot, and I had the meaning to understand, because me and my brother had a library and lodge. We were buying books. My father was giving us allowance every week. And we were buying books to make a private library. We were renting the books to friends and neighbors. More expensive books like Upton Sinclair, Hans Fallada, Jacob Wasserman, Palachek.
Some of the authors.
More expensive books that cost us more money. We were charging like 25 cents which equals a quarter. Cheated books that were criminal books, like Mashelsky, a Polish criminal writer, Potowski, or Edgar Wallace, Maurice LeBlanc, that has the favorite, Arsène Lupin was his favorite in the...
So, and I think that's where it ends. So the reason why I put that in, even though, some of those authors' names might not resonate with you, you might not have heard of, Upton Sinclair or some of the other Jacob Wasserman or the things, but they were books that were kind of on the cutting edge. They were books that were maybe considered to be not okay to own. And so because of that, they had to burn them ahead of the SS coming in and burning them and maybe potentially putting their family at risk. So they actually burnt those books in the wood stove. And my Uncle Max, who was in concentration camps and survived several different situations, this is the only time in his entire 4-hour testimony that he breaks down crying. So I like to include it because it kind of is a little bit of a kernel of thought. Why, after living through so many horrible things, unspeakable things that he couldn't even express, even in his testimony, some of those things, but this was the only time that he actually broke down, and really because he was going back in time to that little 12-year-old kid and realizing how everything he thought about his life and his future and the world as he knew it had been turned completely upside down. And he goes on to talk about how the German culture was a high culture. It was full of academics. It was full of really free-thinking, idealistic people. Yet somehow this scapegoatism was able to take hold and spread across not just one nation, but many nations. So this is his sort of tipping point as a kid, realizing not only is his dream of a librarian, becoming a librarian, probably shot, and it was, he never did wind up doing that, but he also realized that life was changing at this very moment. We can move on to the next slide. So, takes you right up to my grandfather's birthday, which I like to say was the worst birthday ever. Imagine this, you're turning 17 and you go to work, so he was already at work, and you find out about midway through the day, they blow a whistle, they say, well, we've been invaded, Poland has fallen, Jews do no longer have a job, you have to go home now. And he walked home and he saw the Nazi flag being raised in the town square, like in the center of his town, and that was his birthday. And he went home and he said he lost his voice, which to me was he just couldn't speak. He had no words for what was happening to him as a 17-year-old on his actual birthday, seeing that, losing pretty much everything on that very day. So very significant. It just so happened that September the 8th of 1939 was not only his birthday, but the day that Lodz was occupied by the Nazis. And some of those pictures and some of the things that you'll see here in the next slide are not from my grandfather specifically, but images of boycotts. So my grandfather said it didn't start like, everybody in a ghetto. It started like nobody can buy things from Jewish businesses. Just boycotting. Don't, give them any money. Don't go to any of the places that they serve in the community. Then they built the ghetto up around my grandfather's neighborhood, and the new rules included a curfew which made the milk route impossible, because after that curfew was established, they couldn't walk that 7-kilometer route anymore, and that's when their German farmer friends started to bring the milk a little bit closer to them to circumvent, to get around those rules that were being created for Jewish people not to be able to be on the street from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. So that was pretty much some of those prime travel times for them. They would get up at the crack of dawn to go get the milk, and they would be going till far after dark. So they tried to limp along with this, a little bit of help, But the other rule was, of course, the precursor to the Jewish star. They had to wear an armband, which you can see in that image. And we can go to the next. Another little song from my papa. This is about the leader of the Lodz ghetto, who was named Chaim Rumkowski. Kind of a bad situation for him. He was a well-to-do leader in the community, a Jewish man, and he was tapped by the SS, by the Nazis, to become the leader of the ghetto. Well, you got certain privileges from being the leader, right? And you also maybe could exert some influence, but it was a pretty tough situation to be in. So a lot of the residents did not like him, and so they made up what I would call like a parody song. So like, I don't know who does parodies now, but like when I was growing up, it was Weird Al, if anybody knows Weird Al Yankovic, and like just a song that was something, maybe a tune that people already knew, but it was kind of like a joke about this guy just saying kind of how two-faced he was. So you can listen to my grandfather just sing a tiny bit of it, and these are some of the lyrics.
You ask a question. How I can ask him a name.
Who was in charge of the ghetto?
But the Jewish people was Chaim Rumkowski. Rumkowski Chaim, and get them to crying. There used to be a song with them in the ghetto. They organized a song.
So yeah, and we can go to the next. It's just a fun little thing. So my papa, as I mentioned before, he had a really big family, but the slide is entitled The Only One. So my papa decided he was going to escape the ghetto after a couple months of living in the situation that he was living in, and it was getting worse every single day. He always said, I ran away, but I like to set the record straight when I talk about him. He begged his family to go with him, okay? He would say it like, I ran away, and he felt a lot of guilt, okay? He left his family behind. And as you'll see, well, you saw my uncle, so you know that he survived, but he left a lot of family behind that he would not see again. And it was not easy, but he could see what was going to happen. And his parents were more thinking along the lines of like, and you know, if you have younger siblings, maybe you would understand, like, you're older, maybe you'd be okay, but like, how would like a 3-year-old do on the run? How would like a 12-year-old do in these situations? Not only that, you're in your nice, comfortable home. Your life is hard, but you know, especially historically for Jewish people, I mean, every holiday is like, they tried to kill us, they didn't do it, let's eat. We already kind of know the drill, so they're thinking, well, it's not that bad. How bad can it get? But as my grandfather said in his testimony, if they would have known what was to come, everybody would have run. Everybody would have run. The only reason they didn't is because they could not imagine, like who could imagine the kind of things that were to come? So my grandfather, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, because I don't think I'd be here today if he hadn't have decided to do so. He decided this wasn't the thing. He wasn't going to wait around to find out, and he made a plan. And he decided that the safest place for him, and it sounds crazy, was the Soviet Union. So he started making his way sort of to like that northern route that in the slide, that's why I'm going like this, to Warsaw first, then to Białystok, and then over what was called the demarcation line. Now, I make it sound like that happened in 5 minutes, but it took him months to get over the demarcation line. And so on the border of the demarcation line, he may have gotten there within weeks of his initial journey, but he had to stay there in little villages and figure out how to survive for months and months and months until he was able to get over that line. So in the meantime, he gets there. Trains and planes and automobiles, not really, but you know, he was on trains, he was on foot, he did everything that he could to get over to that area. And he said when he got there, there were like hundreds of other refugees who were trying to do the same thing. And they were staying in a big synagogue at night where everybody was kind of sleeping in, you know, like a refugee camp. And then in the day, they would go to the line and they would try to cross this line. And after several days, he said he was caught in a rainstorm. He had his bag on him still with some of the things his mom had packed for him, some bread and some soap. And, you know, I mean, moms are moms, Jewish moms especially. Like, of course, you got to be clean, you know, you got to wash your face and you got to have something to eat. So she packed him the best she could. And he was out there in the rain. Well, we didn't have like Gore-Tex and fancy backpacks back then. Everything got soaked. And my grandfather was starving. He didn't know when his next meal was going to come, and he reached into his backpack and he saw that the bread and the soap were all mixed together, and he ate it anyway. And it's just like a thing where you can almost sort of taste that if you've ever tasted soap, you know, and that's how desperate he was. And he had something to eat, you know, and I'm sure didn't feel good later, but that was something that he always remembered. And like I said, out of hundreds of relatives, close family that got together on vacations, that did everything together for holidays, he was the only one to run at this time and in this way. All right, and we'll move on to the next one. Now, my grandfather was still a young guy. He was like, you know, 17 years old. And he had feelings, you know, he was away from his family. He'd been out there for a while. He started to get really desperate. And so this is just a little story about him screaming and yelling in the middle of the street, saying he's going to go turn himself in to the Germans. He just wants to see his family again. He misses his mom. He misses his baby sister. And this guy comes up to him and he's like, you know, kind of like slap him on his cheeks and says, hey, you know, you better watch it. You're going to get yourself killed. And it turns out here's this Jewish policeman. Now, I mentioned my grandfather's name was Nathan, but everyone called him Nuchem. And this policeman's name was Nuchem. And he told us, this is Nuchem from Yannick. He was an angel. He saved my life. So anytime in my family, if something miraculous would happen when my grandfather was alive, he would just say, it was a gift from Nuchem from Yannick. So Nuchem from Yannick helped him kind of get calm, and then organized, as he said, a place for him to stay with another family who would feed him and give him some odd jobs. And they sort of tossed him, or passed him rather, not tossed, around this neighborhood to a few different families until he kind of got himself mentally and sort of physically together. He wasn't starving and so desperate anymore. And then he was able to kind of hustle and survive for the next few months. We can move on. Beyond the demarcation line. So he finally gets over in August of 1940. So he left in November of 39, and it takes him all the way till August to get over that line. So imagine the sort of hustling and the kind of survival that he had to do up until this day. And you would think, okay, great, now you've gotten over this line. This is like the thing, there's the finish line, right? And everything's gonna be like super wonderful now. Well, no. He was sent to work in a hard labor camp up in the middle of the Ural Mountains. It's a steel factory of the whole entire world called Magnitogorsk. And he was sent to do hard labor. And it wasn't easy. And at night, he had a barracks that he was staying in. And he said that there were Russian guards, and they would throw stuff on him. Like heavy stuff, like I mean, I picture like in, you know, a sort of a comical way, like, you know, like in like Bugs Bunny and like the anvils coming down from the sky or whatever. But really, that's terrifying. He couldn't get any sleep, and he was just worried that at any second, that's it, his life is gonna be over. So he asked at work, like one of his coworkers who he knew was another Polish guy who was from a different part of Poland, and he told him what was going on, and the guy was like, oh, you know, I know actually a family who has a little, like a house or a little apartment building, and they're kind of, you would really like them actually. Like there's like a single girl, she's really nice, she comes from a good family, like here he is playing matchmaker. And my grandfather, who was very lonely and sort of emotional, as you guys kind of saw from the whole Nuchem and Yannick episode, he wanted to glom right on. Like he was like, family? There's somebody here with like a sister and a little boy, like a 3-year-old nephew, and she was there with her sister, and there was a brother that would like come in and out, my Uncle Sam, my Uncle Shmuel, and that was it. He glommed onto them. My grandmother was like, yeah, that was it. We couldn't get rid of him, but he started to take care of them. And so that sort of eased him also into living in this house where he didn't have things being thrown on him, and now he's sort of got a new family, and it gave him sort of a reason to live, a reason to work harder, a reason to, as he said, gamble with the boys all night and make their money so that instead of them buying, well, they're in Russia, so vodka, sorry guys, he would buy bread. you know? So he was like, he was a hustler, but he was like, I want to eat, you know, I want to live. I want to make sure that my family has what they need to live. And these pictures are just kind of denoting the environment of Magnitogorsk. It is like way up there in Russia. Maybe one day I'll get there, but it looks like a real hard place to live. We can move on. So this is my grandmother's story. Now my grandmother actually is a very interesting story, but I just have a few little slides here, or a few little pieces of artwork actually that I made about her story when I was in college. So she was born in a different part of Poland called Pruchnik, which was actually very close to the German border, only about 30 kilometers away. Very cute little barbarian-looking village. Born into a family of tailors. Unlike my grandfather, she was kind of well-to-do, had a nice life growing up. She just made scarves and sweaters before the war with her mother and learned how to sew buttons and was just kind of learning to take over the family business. And then, well, Poland is invaded, the Nazis come, they get to their town and they just start to burn everything down. That's not the best thing, you know? So they heard that something like this was gonna happen. They had a cement safe, so, you know, not a metal one, but made out of like cement, and they put money into this safe, and then they were driven out of their town, actually. The German army came, and they were like, okay, you guys all have to walk to this place like 50 miles away. So they walked, and they walked, and they walked, and then they got there, and they were like, oh, you guys all have to go back. They went back, and everything had been burned down, so they dug up their safe, split the money between like all the siblings. My grandmother came from like 12 siblings, so there was a lot of kids. She had about like $600, and she sewed it into the lining of her fur coat, which she was wearing to stay warm. And she, like my grandfather, wound up in one of these refugee-like situations where a lot of people sleeping in one place, you know. She had her coat on like sort of over her to keep her warm at night. She wasn't wearing it. Somebody stole the coat off of her body, like off her sleeping body. She woke up, she's freezing, and the coat's gone, and so is the $600. So boom, yeah. So like, we always wondered if they ever found it. Like they were like, something's crumpling around in here, you know, like, and that could have saved somebody else's life, who knows? Or if they just were warm for, you know, and who knows what happened. But my grandmother never lost that habit of hiding money, because she was always worried that somebody was gonna come and, you know, disrupt their lives. And so she not only hid money in her closet, so when she passed away, we had to go through everything. We found like $2,000 in a shoulder pad. We found like another like $900 in a high-heeled shoe. We found, my mom was looking for like her necklaces that she said, she wore them every day, taped to the underside of her drawer at night. Every night she would tape it. Like, I don't know what she thought, like either if people come in, they're never gonna find everything. Like, she just didn't want anyone to steal her stuff. And she always had money for me. So like whenever I would come to visit her, or she would come to my house, she always had a little 20 for me. Now we know, you know, she had stashes of them, they were all 20s. But yeah, she had that as sort of like a reflex and sort of like a little bit of post-traumatic. So that's how she was introduced, as an heiress who lost all her money, but nonetheless came from a good family. And this is a picture of her family before the war. So we don't have a lot of things that survived, but this was one picture that did. I wish my grandfather would have explained who everybody was in the picture, but he did not. So all I know is that this is potentially my grandmother's parents and some of her siblings. Like I said, she had 12, so not sure who they are. And so you can move on. These are a little bit more quick, kind of giving you guys a little bit of the people who we talked about. My grandfather all the way over there, and then in the middle, my Uncle Max, and then this is my Uncle Shmuel, who was my grandmother's brother and who I'm actually named after. His name was Shmuel or Sam. My name is Stacy. Never mind that my sister, born 5 years later, is named Samantha and is not named after my Uncle Sam. I'll never understand it, make it make sense. But I'm named after that guy right there. And as my grandfather, like I said, he had a lot of quotes. One of the things that he always said was, know your history, the history of the Jewish people. So not just the history of, you know, everybody, but also to know my own history, where I came from, just like I sort of started. To know where you're going, you have to know where you're coming from. Beep. And so these are my, my mom and my uncle. So the cool thing about my grandparents is that they found each other in Magnitogorsk in this like crazy situation, and they decided to start a family in the middle of this crazy time. And by the time they had my uncle, the war was over, and they were looking for their lost relatives. Now, my uncle Shmuel and my grandmother and her sister Celia and Dove, who were that little family that my grandpa glommed onto, they all wanted to go to Israel. And my grandfather actually found his brother, who survived, in Germany in a displaced persons camp after the war. He heard from other people that his brother had survived. And when he found his brother had just gotten married, actually, and he was wanting to go to America. And they caught up. He went and found him. The interviewer said, "Did you recognize him?" And my grandfather laughed and he said, "Recognize him? He looks just like me." So, you know, he knew who he was. He opened the door, they hugged. And my grandfather said it was like this. So after the war, if you survived and somebody else, you saw another survivor, you would say to them like, "Hi, I'm Nochem from Lodz. Do you know anything about my family?" And you'd say they're family members. And then they would say like, "Hi, you know, I'm Stacy from wherever, and, you know, or I'm Rachel from Pushkin. Do you know anything that happened to my people?" And in that way, they would get information. So it was no like internet, there was no, you know, finding each other that way. They had to go through word of mouth. And then he traveled to a different place to find my uncle. Well, faced with this decision, like, do we go to Israel? Do we go to America? He wanted, of course, to be with his brother and the family that had survived. He found out, sadly, that my great-grandmother, Bluma, my great-grandfather, Fischel, and his little sister had died at Treblinka, in the gas chambers. So he found out from Max, they caught up, they found out a little bit, and Max said, "Well, I'm going to America with my new wife, and we're starting a life." And my grandfather, well, the story was he wanted to go, and my grandmother said, "I'm having my baby in Israel." She was pregnant with my mom. She said, "So you can go with your brother, or you can come with me." She was not a woman of many words, but she was strong when she needed to be, so he followed her. That was his ultimatum, and he took it, and they moved to Israel, which is where my mom was born, in a displaced persons camp. So she was born in a place for refugees in the year 1949, just shortly after Israel was given statehood. So it was definitely a tumultuous time. We can go to the next slide. And my grandfather had to serve in the army there. This is a picture of my grandfather in, before it was called the IDF, it was just the Israeli army, and he was in that through the late 40s up and through the 50s. And like I mentioned, and I sometimes like to say, my grandfather, like I think one of the reasons he survived is because he didn't volunteer to fight. He said he tried to at first, but they said he was too young, and he was like scrawny, and they didn't think he was going to do any good. And the Polish army was like weak. They got overturned in like a week. You know, it didn't take very long. He didn't really have any way to go. They didn't want him in the Soviet army. But my grandfather was kind of more of like a peaceful guy. He probably wouldn't have been that great at fighting. You know, some people have stories like their grandpa was a fighter and he was in the resistance and he fought in the woods, and, you know, like the Bielski brothers or something really cool. I'm like, no, my grandfather was like, I'm going to hustle, I'm going to survive. And he was obsessed with having children and grandchildren, and that was what he wanted to do. So he didn't like serving in the army. He knew it was his obligation to serve in the army, and he was like not really that into it. But he knew that he had to do it because it's such a difficult thing in this life. As he said, it's not easy to be a Jew. And as a kid, hearing these things, you're kind of like, okay, this is really heavy. But as you grow up and you start to see the way the world is, you know, for me at least, it was very much, he gave me that sort of inspiration to keep his story going. So that's really a lot of what I do. Yep, we can move on. Another picture of me as a kid with my sister and my grandfather, because like he said to me every single time I saw him, either he called me his nachas, which is like a treasure in Yiddish, or a dividend, which is like what it sounds like from the stocks, like when you make your dividends, because he loved his stocks. Or he would tell us every time, I never thought I would live to see another generation of Jews, because we were, you know, supposed to be, if the plan went accordingly, wiped out. And so the fact that we were here, he had children and grandchildren. To him, that was what he lived to do. It might sound pretty humble. Other people live to, you know, make movies, go do amazing things, be the president. My grandfather just wanted to survive. That's all they wanted, and to live a peaceful life. Beep. At the end of every survivor's Shoah Foundation testimony, that survivor is asked, what advice do you have for your children or your grandchildren? And that, again, it's like a broken record, guys, that they remember that they are Jewish, that they are awake. So this guy, my whole life, kind of telling me these things, and really me going, are you paranoid, Papa? Like, are you, like, and my grandma, like, you really think, like, people are going to come after us? But as, you know, we've seen, there are reasons why they instilled that in me. And so that is why I'm here. We'll do one more, I believe. Here was where I said, you are my nachas. That is the treasure, my dividends. And my grandfather was very proud of and was very much in favor of education. He wanted us to go to high school, finish high school. This is my high school graduation. Well, you know, precursor to you guys soon one day. And then it was really great that he was there. That was important to him, that his children and his grandchildren were educated, that they knew not only their own history, but knew things about the world. Like, my grandfather was an amazing guy. He was literally the first social justice warrior I knew, always taking care of homeless people in front of his restaurant and doing amazing things for his community. So I learned from him, you can go to the next slide, and I hope I'm living up to it, to someday, he used to always tell me, maybe someday you'll be a great person. Now, I think we're all great people. Like, I think you guys are also great people. But I think if you just woke up and somebody told you all the time, you're great, like, you wouldn't have to do anything, right? So my grandfather made me have to kind of aspire. Maybe you'll be a great person. Like, if I knew he loved me, I knew he thought I was awesome, but if he just told me, like, every day, you're great, you're amazing, you don't have to do anything, I'm sure I would just be like, oh, I'm great, you know? He kind of lit that fire under me to be a good person in this world and to do good things.
I'm going to talk very fast because my presentation is usually a little bit over an hour, and I'm told that we have less time for that. And I also would like to leave time for questions and answers. Let me start off by saying, is there anyone here who believes the earth is flat? Good, because if somebody said they believe the earth is flat, I would ask them to leave the room. My second question to you all is, if there's anyone here who believes that the Holocaust never happened, then you can also leave the room. Thank you, because it did occur. The term Holocaust literally means a fire that causes total destruction. Today, it refers to the systematic mass murder of European Jewry by the Germans. Some believe it started in 1938. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is November 9th and November 10th, 1938. That's when it means the night of the broken glass. Tons of shattered glass in the cities of Germany and Austria. Hundreds of Jews were killed. Thousands, children among them, dragged into the streets and physically assaulted. 7,500 Jewish businesses and Jewish hospitals and orphanages were vandalized. 1,100 synagogues were burned. Others assert that the Holocaust actually started in 1933. when Hitler and the Nazi, in parentheses, National Socialist Party, took over the governmental control in Germany and began implementing laws against the Jews. Jews could not own businesses. Jewish children could not go to school after the 4th grade. Curfews were set for Jews. No Jewish professors were allowed, and more. 12 years of Nazi control dominated Germany. Jews were thought of as cockroaches. I was a cockroach. Also, it should be noted that the final solution, in quotes, I'm using the term, the final solution of the Jewish question, which meant the eradication of all Jews in Europe, did not occur until Germany's plan in January of 1942. While millions were killed before, the actual term final solution was decided by Hitler and his conspirators in January of 42. In my mind, the Holocaust is more than European or Jewish history. It's human history. Hitler did not originate anti-Semitism. It did not disappear with his suicide or Germany's defeat in World War II. Anti-Semitism exists today. Before I get started on my family story, this just goes to what I said, the first two lines. And then September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. On September 8th, Germany took control of the city of Lodz, L-O-D-Z, the city where my parents and their families lived. September 26th, a little bit more than 3 weeks later, Germany and the USSR make a pact called the Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact and divide Poland in half. So the eastern half of Poland now belongs to Germans. Lodz was in the western half. But before I get started really about my family's history, these are recent statistics taken. 94% of Americans polled by Gallup after Kristallnacht, after 1938, disapproved of German treatment of Jews. Still, 54% of Americans agreed that persecution of Jews in Europe was partly the Jewish fault. 67% of Americans opposed the bill then in Congress that intended to admit child refugees from Germany. The bill never came up for a vote. When the ship St. Louis came to the United States in 1939 with 936 Jewish refugees, they were not allowed to enter the United States. They had to return to Europe. More than 227 of those 936 were eventually murdered by the Germans. I am the son of two survivors of the Holocaust. I was born in early March of 1945, almost exactly 2 months before World War II ended. Some might say that as I was born prior to the conclusion of the war, I myself am a survivor. I don't agree. I am what's known as a 2G. My parents are survivors. 2G is second generation. My two daughters are 3G, third generation. My 5 grandchildren are 4G, and so on it will go in the future. But I am a sufferer. To this day, I suffer from the effects that the Holocaust had on my family. I have PTSD. I think you know what that is. Survivors are dying off. Few are alive today. I met one today, which is just wonderful, when we were having lunch, and she actually was on the St. Louis. That's the first time I ever met a survivor of the St. Louis, and it was such an amazing, amazing pleasure and privilege to have met this lovely, lovely person. But as most survivors are dying off, I am here replacing them so you can have as close to a first-hand account and knowledge as to what some of them went through to survive the Holocaust. On Yom HaShoah, which is a Hebrew word, it means Holocaust Remembrance Day, we commemorate the lives and heroism of Jewish people who were slaughtered in the Holocaust between 1933, again, I say 1933 and 1945. In Israel, at 10 a.m. local time, dozens of air raid sirens sound to divert everybody from their routine and pray for the victims. Everyone and everything stops and stands still, no matter what he or she was doing before at 10 a.m. All cars, all trucks and buses stop on the roadway to give tribute to the memory of those who were murdered. Now let's start with my family. Let me see where this goes next. This is a picture of how Poland was divided in half. The yellowish part you can see is with the Soviet flag, which was given to the USSR, and the bluish part was taken over by the Germans. My parents, I don't know if you can see, it's in lived in Lodz in the German part of Poland at that time. This is Poland in September of 1939. In November of 23rd, 1939, every Jew had to wear a Star of David, a yellow star, six-pointed star. The next day, my parents began to attempt escapes into the Soviet-occupied Poland. They have to go east. Talk about the other things in a moment. In 1938, my parents, Roman and Mina, Roman Bornstein and Mina Flatow, got married. They and their families lived in Lodz, the second largest city in Poland, Warsaw being the first. In Lodz, 250,000 or 250,000 Jews lived. Warsaw was the largest and had 500,000 Jewish population. In total, Poland had 3 million Jews. In fact, Lodz had more Jews than Great Britain, more Jews than in France, and even more Jews that lived in Germany at that time. Many Jews over the years of Nazi power had left Germany to other countries, leaving to go to Belgium or the Netherlands, which didn't save them. As when Germans conquered those countries during World War II, the same final solution was applied. You might have read about the diary of Anne Frank. Her parents and she were originally from Germany. Then they went to Antwerp, and then once the Germans controlled their city, they were killed. My father's real name at birth was Reuven, but everybody knew him as Roman. He graduated recently from a law school in Vilna, then a city in Poland. Now it's called Vilnius in Lithuania. He had 2 older sisters, Rosa, who moved to Palestine a few years before World War II. So she was out of Europe, thank God, to marry a man living in Palestine. Rala, my father's other sister, survived the war because of my father. You will learn the details shortly. My father also had an identical twin brother, Adam, who was a pharmacist, who likewise survived the Holocaust in a similar fashion to my dad. Excuse me. Here. I hope you can see this. This is my mother's family. Her father was called Herschel. Her mother was called Blima. They had Anna as a daughter, who was a dentist. Anna had a son whose name, believe it or not, was Jersey. How's that? Ironic. In Polish, Jerscy. They had another daughter, Frana. They had a son, Edmund, and another son, oh, jeez, Raymond. Anna went to Auschwitz, and then as the Russians were about to liberate, she survived Auschwitz for a couple of years. As the Russians were about to liberate Auschwitz, the concentration camp, she was put on a death march. They tried to get rid of all of the people that still were prisoners in Auschwitz. And then she died of typhus on that death march. Jersey was 6 years old when he went into Auschwitz with his mother, and he was immediately gassed and his body burned. Franya, I have no idea what happened to her. It's as if she's off the world. Edmund was a doctor. He lived in Warsaw, and there was an uprising in Warsaw by a few hundred men against the Germans that lasted only 3 weeks, and he was killed fighting the Germans during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Raymond, we also called Marian. He survived in a very unusual story, but he survived. Herschel and Blima, Herschel was a diabetic. I'm sorry, Blima was a diabetic, but no Jews were allowed insulin. So she was murdered by her diabetes because Jews weren't allowed to have insulin. Herschel starved to death on the streets of Lodz. My father his dad and his mom, Jesus, he had, my father was Roman, Rosa, Rala, and Adam. You have me coming from my father, and now 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. Rosa emigrated to Palestine before the war. She had 1 son, and she died of tuberculosis at a very young age in Palestine. Rala had also 1 son, who now lives in Florida, and Adam had 1 daughter, Helena. Roman and Adam, or Romek and Adek, however you want to pronounce it, they were identical twin brothers. So Helena and I are both half-brother and half-sister and first cousins, only because our parents were identical twin brothers. So genetically, we are half-brother, half-sister, but also first cousins. I'm losing it a little bit. My father's parents, were taken in September of 1941 with 6,000 other people who were 60 years of age and older out of Lodge in vans. They were all placed in, I don't know the number of vans, but maybe had 50 or 60 people in each van, so God knows how many. But there were 6,000 of them, all 60 years and older. They were taken by vans to a place called Helm No, which was like a concentration camp. But they didn't even get out of the vans, because what's in Helm No, the vans locked them inside and then put the carbon monoxide that the engines of the vans were making into the vans, and so they were all murdered by carbon monoxide poisoning while in the vans, and then they were buried in a pit. So those were my father's parents. Luckily, all of his siblings survived. I didn't put my mother's name here, but my mother's name is Mina, and she had me with my father as an only child. So that's pretty much the family. Now, how did my parents survive? Sorry. My mother was also a pharmacist, and that's how she met my father, because his brother, being a pharmacist, introduced my mother to my father, and they got married. On 9/12 of every year, which is the date my grandparents were murdered, I wrote down 1941, but actually I made a mistake. It was 1942. But on September 5th of 1942 is when they were murdered in the vans, and I light what's called in the Jewish tradition a yurtzeit memorial candle. It's a candle, and we say a Hebrew prayer in honor of the dead person or persons. And the light stays on until it goes off. It usually lasts about 24, 25 hours. And I give prayers to them. It's my wife telling me I should speak louder. So if anyone doesn't hear me, please raise your hand or just yell, speak louder. You may have noticed that I use the term murdered or slaughtered rather than died most of the time. One dies from infection or even diabetes, but not when you're a prisoner at an extermination camp or in a ghetto. Of the 230-some thousand Jews that lived in Lodz, as I said, anyone want to guess how many survived the Holocaust? 877. So out of 250,000 Jews, only less than 900 survived. So being born in March of 45, I never got to meet any of my grandparents whatsoever. I never got to meet two of my aunts and uncle, their spouses, or my first cousin. My father was brilliant. He knew something was going to happen when the Germans invaded Poland. He understood the Jews living there were in trouble. If you studied European history, as I said, Poland was divided in half. Now my father says, we have to leave, to my mother. They're on the German side. Actually, a few days after the Germans occupied his city, 2 SS stormtroopers forced their way into my parents' apartment. There's, I don't know if you know what a mezuzah is, on a Jewish door sill. There's a little ceramic vial with a little piece of the Bible in it. Just small little parchment in this little canister made of ceramic. And every Jewish house has that on a doorway. 2 SS officers broke into my parents' apartment. They took the scroll of the Bible out of that ceramic vial, put that piece of scroll or paper into my mother's hands, and lit it on fire, making her hold it. Imagine, you're holding a piece of burning paper and you can't get rid of it. My father tried to help her, and they beat my father to a pulp. They told my parents that they would be coming back in a few days to take everything away from them. Guess what my father decided to do? He had to escape. Now, hard part about escaping, I mean, it's hard in many ways, but the hard part in escaping is, how does he convince my mother to leave her family? You know, this is a war. Wars end. After a war ends, you get reunited. You know, war lasts 3 years, 5 years, but unless you're a soldier, families are going to reunite after the war. But my father realized he had to convince my mother that they had to flee. And so they did. Within days, my father convinced her, and then they went, see if I can go back. They went from the blue area of German-occupied Poland, Lodz, into the orange area of occupied Poland, occupied by the USSR. They lived in a small little village. Once they bribed somebody, there's a river called the Bug River that separates this area, and they bribed somebody to take them across the river. They spent a little time in a village near the border, and then Stalin, who was the dictator of the USSR, took them and thousands of other Jews who did the same thing that my parents, about 200,000 Jews escaped that way. And he put my parents above the Arctic Circle in Siberia in a slave labor camp. For 3 years, my father is a lawyer, my mother's a pharmacist, are now slaves in a slave labor camp where all they do is chop down wood, trees, then into logs, and then load barges with the logs for 3 years. My father developed snow blindness. Remember, you're above the Arctic Circle. In Siberia, 96% of the time, the area is all covered with snow. Once we were in this country, and I'll get to that later, when we were in this country and my father had a driver's license, but if it snowed and there was snow on the road, he couldn't drive. He was blind because of the experiences that he had. Eventually, after 3 years, Stalin made a deal because the Germans now in 1941 betrayed their treaty with the Soviet Union. And late in 1943, so 3 years, my parents were then allowed to leave the slave labor camp, but forced to travel to Iran for what was called Anders' army. There was a Polish general by the name of Władysław Anders who, with the help of the British, formed an army to help fight against the Germans. My uncle, Marian, went into that Anders army. My mother, being a pharmacist, did something brilliant. When my father went through his physical recruitment that he had to do to join Anders' army, she gave him medication that made him look and appear sick and urinate bloody urine. And so because of that peeing blood, he was refused entry into Anders' army, and that may have saved his life. Anders' army later won a major battle against the Germans and the Italians in Mount Cassino, Italy. Anyway, 3 years, and now Stalin lets them go. Takes them almost a year to get down to Tehran, which is Tehran now, currently called Tehran, but in those days was Tehran. It's in Iran. And the man, hold on, I gotta get up. This is my mother. This is my father. This is Marian, my mother's sister, who is in a uniform because he's in Anders' army. And this is my aunt. He's my uncle, but my mother's brother. And this is Rala, my aunt, who's my father's here, I'm sorry. I said here. This is my father looking over to the side. And this is my father's sister, Rala. My mother, my father, Rala, and Marian. Now, they're in Tehran in a DPW camp for 9 months. DPW, I think you know, it means a displaced persons camp. And they want to get into Palestine. But the British, they don't want Jews in Palestine. They don't want any more Jews in Palestine. So my parents bribe and get false papers so that they are Gentiles instead of Jewish. Gentiles means Catholic, Protestant, but not Jewish at all. And with those fake, illegitimate, false identity papers, they made it into Palestine. Guess what happened 9 months after they made it into Palestine? You're looking at them. Yep, that was the only time that it was safe. Okay, as an OBGYN, excuse me, gentlemen, for what I'm about to say. As an OBGYN, I know a lot about women's hormones. When women are under severe, severe stress, like the women in the camps up in Siberia were, their hormonal status kind of shuts down and they lose their periods because their estrogen comes down. It's a safety precaution because if you get pregnant in this area, it could be the death of both the baby and the mother. So it's really to save the woman's health by doing that. But now, once they're out of that situation, the hormones come back into play and menses resume and life continues. And 9 months later, here I am. My father fought in 1948 with the Haggadah. The Haggadah was the terrorist, at that time, organization like Irgun that fought against the British to make Israel an independent country of its own. Understand, Jews had lived in Israel or Palestine for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But now we have to fight for a country because there's nowhere safe. Look at what happened in the 1200s. The British Crusaders murdered thousands and thousands of Jews. Look at what happened in 1492. The Spanish Inquisition murdered thousands and thousands of Jews. In 1600s in Venice, the Italians murdered thousands and thousands of Jews. In 1900s, early 1900s, you had the pogroms in Eastern Europe, where thousands of Jews were murdered. And now, in the 1930s to the 1940s, you have the Holocaust, where 6 million, of which 1.5 million were children, were murdered. We got our country in 1948. That's my first memory of life. I'm in a bunker, 3 years old, for 4 weeks with other children, sleeping on the floor. There were a couple of bunk beds that you sometimes could get, and only children, except for one woman, red-headed woman, who sat at the bottom of the stairway down into the bunker, and whose face I don't remember. I only remember her beautiful red hair, which went well below her shoulders. Why? Because she's not facing us. She's facing the staircase coming down. And next to her is a huge pile of rocks. Why? Because if the Arabs attack us in that bunker of children, those rocks are her ammunition to try to stop the Arabs from attacking us as children. We win. Israel becomes a state. The United States helps by declaring Israel a state at the United Nations, and Israel becomes a state. My father, who fought, my mother had to work as a pharmacist because that was an important job. My father decides I'm the only child he's ever going to have. My father knows that there's going to be other wars versus the Palestinians and the Israelis, or Arabs and Israelis, whatever you want to call the mixture. And he has only one child. And so he has a rich, rich uncle who came to the United States around 1895, I'm not sure the exact year, and built a silk manufacturing textile mill in Paterson, New Jersey. And he supported my parents into coming as immigrants in 1951. My parents are seasick throughout the entire trip across the Atlantic. We went from Haifa to Marseille, and then picked a beautiful boat, which is famous. I won't go into its details, but it was called the Ile-de-France, and went on the Ile-de-France from Marseille, France, to the New York harbor. And my parents were seasick throughout the entire voyage, but I wasn't. And I'm a 6-year-old kid now, and I have the run of the ship, even though we're third-class passengers. So I'm running around the ship. And one day, as we're getting closer to New York City, I happen to be on the bow of the boat. And what do I see? Anybody? Yes. Who said that? 100% correct. The Statue of Liberty. I didn't know the meaning of it. You know, I couldn't read English, so whatever writing was on it, I had no idea. But this beautiful woman statue in the harbor of New York City, beckoning me. And the Statue of Liberty gave me a gift. That gift was liberty. To live in a country that, for the most part, I mean, listen, there's racism, there's anti-Semitism, there's lots of things that aren't good. But for the most part, and in this room, even those that are sleeping, in this room, everyone here is decent. You're decent people, and you need to stay decent. I went to school in Paterson, New Jersey. You might have some time, if you probably haven't seen the movie, but there's an amazing movie called Lean on Me about East Side High School in Paterson. And it was a good town growing up. There was no anti-racism in a high school. There was no discrimination in the high school. In elementary schools, there were. I went to an elementary school where I was the only Jewish person, and sometimes I had to carry an umbrella on clear days to use as defense mechanism, because some of the guys would try to beat me up because I was Jewish. So there was anti-Semitism, but not in high school. Everybody got along very, very well. Unfortunately, once high school let out, everybody moved to a different area of the town. Jews lived in this area, blacks lived in this area, Italians lived in this area, and the other area was a little bit of a mixture. Okay, I think I'm just about done. I want to talk a little bit about by the way, this is important to know also. Genocide, another word, not so much for the Holocaust, but genocide, the murder of thousands and thousands of people, has occurred in your lifetime. Armenia, not in your lifetime, but before. But Rwanda, Myanmar, Serbia, Croatia, Sudan, Cambodia. American governments, our ancestors in the United States, committed genocides against Native American Indians, against Hawaiians, and against Filipinos. I believe you are the future, and I believe you are going to take a mantle upon your shoulders to help those in need, not hurt them. I want to talk to you about one last thing. This is a little controversial. It's a topic known as epigenetics. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Scientists took a first generation of mice and exposed them to cherry blossom aroma. And every time they exposed them to cherry blossom aroma, they used electrical voltage on those mice. So in the future, anytime those mice were exposed to cherry blossom aroma, they panicked, and rightfully so, because they were going to be voltage hurt. The scientists, this is a disgusting scientific study, but it was done. The scientists did nothing to the second generation of mice. Nothing at all. When the third generation of mice was born, the first generation was gone, off the world. When the scientists exposed the third generation of mice to cherry blossom aroma, without using any electrical voltage whatsoever, those mice panicked. They had, I don't know if the right word is inherited, but somehow their gene modulation had changed, not their actual genes, but the modulation of how the genes interact with each other had changed. And so that third generation of mice was scared to death of cherry blossom aroma. And I guess one more story. My wife and I are traveling in Australia on a tourist train. Beautiful in the jungle of Australia. It's just two cars, only tourists. You know, it's not like it's going from New York City to Boston or, you know, just a tourist train. And the loudspeaker comes on, and the loudspeaker says in English, Australian English, but what any one of us can understand, and says what we're going to be seeing and what experiences we're going to be having during this 2.5 hour tourist train. And then the loudspeaker goes off. 30 seconds later, the loudspeaker comes back on. This time, the loudspeaker is speaking in German, telling exactly what it said in English, but now to Germans. I go crazy. I'm on a train that's German, like my relatives. I have PTSD. Goosebumps. My blood pressure, God knows how high it was. I didn't take it, but my God, I'm sure my blood pressure was up in well over what's normal. I'm scared to death. I wanna break the window. I wanna get out. I wanna climb out. My wife's trying to calm me down. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Again, that's the generation of mice that's being exposed to cherry blossom aroma. So, last thing. These are the lessons of the Holocaust. Hold on a second, give you more. That's my passport. My father, you know, we talked about this. My father fought in 48. In 51, we come to the United States. This is the passport that the three of us are together, my father, my mother, and look at that gorgeous little child at the bottom. Who do you think that is? Me. Wasn't that gorgeous? Nobody picked me for an acting role on TV, though. And this is, I think I was 8 years old, my parents, in 52, so I'm sorry, I was 7 years old. My parents later on in life. You can see, you look at my mother, if there's anybody who reads body language in a way, my father is not giving you a big smile. My mother, it's a tiny smile, but look at her eyes. Again, I'm interpreting it the way I interpret it, and maybe other people would interpret it differently. But there's something there that was there for the rest of their lives. This is a book I wrote. It's not for sale. It was just something I wrote and had printed up and given to my family. That's a picture of me at the moment that I delivered the last child. I retired from obstetrics after the doctor whose wife I delivered, a friend of mine, took this picture of me. And that small picture that I'm kind of looking at, that small baby, is actually me as a baby boy, not the child I delivered. That's it. So I just, in summary, want to say the following. These are the lessons from the Holocaust. First, if an enemy of our people says he seeks to destroy us, believe him. Don't doubt him for a moment. Second, When a Jew anywhere in the world is threatened or under attack, do all in your power to come to aid them. Third, a Jew must learn to defend him or herself. You must forever be prepared for whatever threats loom. Fourth, Jewish dignity and honor must be protected in all circumstances. Fifth, stay united in the face of the enemy. Sixth, while anti-Semitism is on the rise today, it comes from all religions, from politicians, both left and right, from all directions. That's a pattern to Jewish history. In our long annals as a nation, as a people, we rise, we fall, we return. We are exiled, we are enslaved, we rebel, and again we suffer destruction, climbing in my lifetime in the Holocaust, and then followed by the rebirth of the Jewish state Israel.